Hi, and welcome to your Tuesday 2-minute tip. Herbs versus spices. What is the difference and how do you use these in your kitchen? So very generally, obviously there's exceptions to everything, but very generally, herbs come from the leaf of a plant. So think of basil leaves or rosemary. Those, even though they're long and skinny, those are the leaves of the rosemary plant. Spices typically come from the non-leaf part of a plant. So they can be the berries, they can be the stems, they can be the roots, they can be fruits or other little growths. Sometimes bark, like cinnamon is a bark. And they are often, most often, dried and ground. So spices typically are stronger in flavor. They usually have a lot of essential oils and they tend to be really potent. Sometimes they're the seeds even. And most herbs are served fresh most of the time. That said, obviously there's a huge exception that you can get dried herbs. Like if you get dried oregano, which we use a lot, or even dried thyme and dried basil. Even though they are then dried, they're still herbs because they're the dried leaves and they're still classified as an herb. So that leads me to one of the biggest points of interchanging. If something calls for fresh basil and it's winter, can you substitute dried basil? Yes, you always can. But when you're using the fresh, you can use more of it. And when you're by volume, and when you're using dried herbs, you want to use a little bit less. So if something calls for a tablespoon of dried parsley, or I'm sorry, very important. If something calls for a tablespoon of fresh parsley, you might want to use half as much dried parsley. One of the other really big differences in interchanging fresh herbs versus dried herbs is the point at which you can add it to something. So dried spices typically get added earlier, and fresh spices are often added over the top, or fresh herbs are often added over the top because they taste good. The actual texture of biting into them is delicious, and they're still really bright and flavorful when they're fresh. Versus like a dried oregano, you can add really early into a soup because the feeling of biting into like the dried leaf isn't necessarily so great. So when you add it early, it blends into the dish a little bit more. So if you're interchanging, you can add your dried herbs. See, I keep messing up too. If you're interchanging them, you can add your dried herbs earlier. Like if something calls for dried oregano sprinkled over the top, maybe you want to add that a little bit earlier so it cooks into the dish. You wouldn't typically be mixing herbs and spices because spices are almost always come in the same format. The biggest difference between spices is, are you getting, whole cumin seed or ground cumin? So you're not really interchanging much. If something calls for ground cumin and you only have whole seeds, you're probably going to want to grind that up before adding it to it anyway. So really the only step you're doing in addition is actually grinding the spices. I will do a second one maybe next week about storing spices and how long they actually last, because they can go bad, even though a lot of people have them in their fridge for ever and ever and ever. So I will see you for that next week. Get more information about ends and stems below.